that a lot of the things that we want to do with Undivided regarding decolonization of academia really were really present in the whole documentary. So I feel like, because I was talking about how we as Undivided want to sort of like make a manifesto that we want to hand over to policymakers within the university. And every single time we always sort of have to start explaining to them from the very beginning why you're sort of working on decolonization, what you mean with it. I just had this feeling like I just want to go up to them, give them this documentary and be like, watch it.
Yeah, let's do it.
So I just felt like that's how I felt. But I don't know how, maybe for people here in the room, maybe have further questions if you actually don't even, about the process, but maybe even about the content itself. I think it is the greatest opportunity now if you really have any questions you would like to ask.
I think everyone is processing. So maybe while you're processing, I can start by saying something about the process, and then if you have any questions. First of all, let me say thank you for being here, and also, to Undivided for the invitation. Because when I heard, what is going on right now in your context, I felt I was really happy to share this film, because I was already hoping that it could be of help to you. And it's also exactly the reason why I made this film, because oftentimes, at least the films that I've seen so far dealing with colonial legacy and racism is always geared towards white people and having to convince people of a problem. And I did not want to put that up for discussion. I wanted it to be, there is a problem, we're not going to discuss that. And I want to analyze the problem, and I want to offer a strategy on how to solve it. And this is a huge problem, obviously, but I wanted to provide a historical analysis and connect different struggles so that we know, the work that has to be done. And I wanted to make it accessible to a wider audience, so that through music, people who might not be in academia but who are dealing with the problems have a language and a framework that they can use in their daily lives. And because I'm a musician and I'm involved in the movements myself, and I was writing the music, I felt that this form of documentary and music was a good way to do it. So that's a little bit how it came about.
Okay, I think so. Yeah.
Can I ask a question related to the process? So I'm wondering, how the music got, the composition got connected with the chapters,
Yes.
or the people you were interviewing,
Yeah.
and how this came along, and in your opinion, how you see the power of music as a way to communicate, dialogue, or to the power of music in this process.
Yes, thank you. I love that question. So actually the music came first. I started with the music, and I started just at first with a few songs, writing about my own experiences. And with every song, I realized, wait a minute, this is a bigger story. This is not just, one song, but this is the story of a social movement that I'm part of. And when I started writing the music, I already saw the images in my mind. And the people that I interviewed are people who inspired me on a personal level, because I'm involved in a network, so I hear them, during conferences and lectures, and I speak to them personally. So I really wanted to make their knowledge and their analysis available to a broad audience, and also they know each other. So they are part of a network that tries to, mobilize people. So I thought this was a good way to connect the stories. And the chapters, to me, were actually the part that was most clear. And then it was a way of kind of putting all the pieces together of, because I knew that they would tell the same story, but with different angles. But I do have to say, it's always kind of, a question if they actually will say the things that you hope they will say. So I had to, that's your job as a director, to really, interview people in such a way that they tell you a story that also fits the storyline that you had in mind. But I also learned new things, so also new things came up that I didn't think of and that inspired me. So that was a really nice process. And in terms of the power of art, or in this case music and film, I really think that it's a tool for the masses. And I think that's really, really important if we want to mobilize. Because people might not go to a university or to a lecture, but they will watch a music video. They will go a night out to the movies. And I think in that sense, your mind is already open. Because art is already in itself an invitation to explore. It's up to your own interpretation. And art is a way to invite you and say, okay, this is the perspective of an artist, and it can be a political statement, and it's up to you to decide if you agree with it or not. But at least you have the perspective. And I think that is, the power of art and music, is to invite people to engage, and then let it up to them if they want to further explore.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for your movie, your documentary. I have the impression that at least at our university there are, let's say, two types of counter movements. Mm-hmm. One of them you expressed very clearly. It's the establishment that gets irritated, that mm-hmm. feels threatened, becomes a bit aggressive or mm-hmm. very aggressive. But there is another one at our university, I think, and it's more subtle. It's the initiatives for diversity and applying for funding and giving a prize to a person who in another place, has been challenged for, fighting for diversity and has been sacked, and so now we are giving a prize to that person. And that counter reaction is much more difficult to defend yourself against, because you're called, if you say these are great initiatives, but fundamentally nothing is really changing, and you probably do this in order to allow nothing to change, then you're they don't listen to you, you're not allowed to speak, you're considered very negative. So I find the second type of reaction much more threatening.
Yeah. Good point, and I recognize it because, so this is a film that I made as an artist outside of my job. For my day job, I actually work in diversity and inclusion in higher education. And actually I think we also work with the Leuven. So, and I that is, for me always kind of the spaces that I have to navigate, because diversity is always part of decolonization, but decolonization isn't always part of diversity. And I think that is kind of, the tension that you address. And what I find in my work is that indeed people who deal with diversity think they're progressive and have the best intentions probably, but don't necessarily understand how difficult it can be, how difficult diversity can be. Diversity is sometimes, so, we appreciate all the cultures, and, it's nice, and I know your food and your dances, let's dance together, and it's happy, we have prizes, we celebrate success. But more often, really diversity is about getting uncomfortable, and not everyone is willing to get uncomfortable. And I think, the establishment that I reflected in the film, that is the establishment, that is a voice that is really hard to convince with reason. And maybe I'm optimistic, but I do think that there are people within the diversity field, if you really try to, to challenge them in a constructive way, that sure, there will be people who don't have sincere motives, but I do see people, at least in my work, who really do want to contribute, but just are raised in these Western frameworks, so they don't have a different analysis. And oftentimes when you offer an alternative analysis, it gets uncomfortable, but once they're past that phase, they actually feel like, okay, you know, I'm comfortable now with the uncomfortable, and I'm ready to kind of explore and see what I can do. And maybe that means stop giving prizes and see what we can actually do to create impact. But I do think it's important to keep that conversation going, because I think there are potential allies that we have to foster. Because if we don't do that, I think we stay in our own bubble. And if we stay in our own bubble, you know, we all agree with each other. But we have to do the work outside of it. So I think that is at least a strategy that I try to use.
Yeah.
First of all, fire soundtrack.
Thank you. Available on iTunes.
Yeah, when you like showed up at the end, I was like, oh my god. But no, super, super, and really, I mean, I'm sure we all really appreciate your work.
Thank you.
I guess I wanted to understand kind of what to me was really powerful is when, I can't remember the name, but when I think she's Algerian, when she was saying that our fundamental issue is that we don't like ourselves. And I was wondering to what extent maybe the people that you're involved with or the people that you've shot, how much to me it feels like it's addressing the diversity issue in the context of the other being here in Europe. But how much does it kind of feed into people back home, like where they are? Because, I mean, in one of them when he's talking about we're here because you were there, but in our countries, it's we're here in the mental state that we are because you were here. And sometimes it's like, you know, like when I go back to Sudan, for example, and I'm talking about decolonization and stuff, and everyone's just like, nobody has time for that. Like we have problems of our own. Like we have our own leaders who are in already these mental states. So it's just how much do the processes that you work in feed into the processes back there? Or do they or do they not? Or are they kind of, are they movements on their own?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's a really important question you raise. Actually, one of the first events that we went to film was Bandung of the North. That was last year in May. And that was actually the people who were also in the film coming together in Paris to address how people in the global North can be in solidarity with the people in the global South. Because we recognize that we have a privilege. We have the ability to fight in ways that our communities in the global South can't because of the circumstances. So we recognize that is a different fight, and we recognize that they suffer directly from Western imperialism and colonization, and actually, you know, in some cases, actual still, you know, settler colonialism. For us, it's, you know, a mental issue, and that is the question that they discuss. How can we use the position that we have here to form a global alliance? Because sometimes, and this is, you know, the interesting part about the decolonial movement. We don't have the answers, so we're trying to figure it out along the way, and also we know that it will not work within the Western concept of the nation state. So sometimes, and I think, you know, in that context, the DENK, the political party, is also an interesting example, because on the one hand they are fighting for a piece of the pie, but within, you know, decolonial theory, we question the pie. But in the short term, we do need political representation, because otherwise the policies that are being made will, you know, will exclude us. So these are the dilemmas that we face. So so you get into the establishment and you use your critical voice, but are you also then able to kind of transform that nation state, or are you going to reproduce these structures? And I think that is the question that, you know, lies in front of us, and how we deal with that is really to imagine this, you know, this idea of imagining a new world civilization.
Yeah.
First, again, same as her, like I really enjoy it.
Thank you.
And I wanted to ask about youth participation of the youth population in political terms in general. And I think it's very smart to use elements as music to attract and to make maybe ideas that are for some people to believe more academic or that require you to have time to read and to have time to understand, so more elitist in some way, to make it more in the ground, like you said, like a day-to-day struggle that everyone has. But I was wondering, well, I also liked that it was very very straightforward, that it is a fight and that it shouldn't be taken lightly, and that you shouldn't be afraid to even get to jail for a time, you know, in these type of struggles. But I also was wondering if you were considering to make it also more attractive. I don't mean like banalize the participation as to make it as a party, because it's not. It's something important. But I was thinking about a middle ground in which is also like a more ritualistic thing in which people can find each other, and it's also a struggle, but it's also a place to feel that you encounter each other, and it's also well, in some sort of like a party too. So it would be attractive for everyone, even if you are even against the same protest.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what's the
So just to be sure I understand your question right, what my perspective is on other types of engagement that are maybe less, you know, political and more informal, but still carry this.
I mean, I still think it's important
Yeah,
that
no, I know.
everyone knows it's a fight.
Yeah.
There. But I mean, to make even the fight itself attractive.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
So no, it's nice to be someone that carries an idea, but that you still think of it as something attractive for youth people.
Yeah. So, interesting. I hadn't thought about this angle before. And I think there are two ways of looking at it, at least in my perspective. Because on the one hand, I think the goal of that is to engage people, right? To engage a broad audience. And this is, I think, you know, the frustration of a lot of activists. How do we get people to the protests? How do we get people to engage? Because you feel like, you know, it's always the same people going out on the streets or doing, you know, the work. And I think engagement has different expressions. I'll give you an example. I am the co-founder of a action committee against cultural appropriation of the Hindu celebration Holi with the colored powder. I don't know if you have it also here, but you have a lot of summer Holi parties where white people throw with colored powder and don't understand that it's, you know, a Hindu spiritual foundation. So for us, it was a big challenge to engage the Hindu community because traditionally we're quiet and we don't want to, you know, rock the boat too much because we're well integrated. This is the idea, you know? So we had to find ways to engage them in such a way that is comfortable enough for them. And I think in some settings it could be a party and then you know, try to engage. But in this case, we went to the temples. So we reached out to those spaces where the people are. And we had conversations. And we explained what was going on. And then they felt, because of the spiritual framework, it is your duty as a Hindu to stand up for your community. That was actually the reason why they started to engage. Not because it was fun, but because we spoke to them in a framework that is connected to how they live. So we ended up, we did some protests, but we knew that we wouldn't attract many people. But what we did do was we mobilized a lot of Hindu representatives and collected over 50 signatures for a collective statement. And 50 signatures meaning 50 organizations. So it was a broad coalition. And a year later, or 2 years later, we did a campaign with Meldpunt Discriminatie. I don't know what the English term is, but it's you know, an organization that you can report to. So this is a discrimination incident, and we collected 400 reports. Because for them, we didn't have to go out on the streets, they could go online, file a report, but we made national news with that. And it was now really part of the conversation on cultural appropriation related to anti-racism. So, you know, these are different ways of trying to involve, a bigger participation. And within these processes, you indeed, have your moments. I feel like this is one of those where you feel like, this isn't as bad as, getting arrested. This is actually nice because you get to exchange and you get to kind of, reflect. And it's not all bad, but I think for people who try to avoid the bad, you have to understand that you're gonna face confrontation sometimes, and you have to be prepared for it, and also accept that that is part of the struggle. But again, finding ways of connecting with the people that works for them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I had a question about the music.
Mm-hmm.
So you obviously have a very strong rock background.
Yeah.
So I was curious about how did you make the decision to use this, I would say, overall rock sound,
Yeah.
as opposed to other sounds?
Yeah. So actually, it's really the sound that I have been bringing as a musician the past few years. And I made the music with my band. So I actually grew up with, hip hop and R&B, soul, and also pop rock, but my main inspirations were from soul and hip hop. And the guitar player really grew up with rock and metal, and it was pretty loud. And the drummer grew up with the South American rhythms because he grew up in Suriname. And the bass player grew up in the Netherlands with also more like pop rock vibes. And when we compose, that's what we do. We really do it together. So the rock sound is really the guitar player just playing what he feels, and then I respond to it because then I hear the melodies, and it's really a collective, fun process that really reflects also the diversity in our band. Yeah. So for us, it's a very natural outcome.
I actually have two questions. The first one is the analysis of racism, since it is the legacy of colonialism. It's actually a very optimistic reading, I think, of the analysis of racism. And I was wondering what you think about the nature-nurture discussion. Is it that we are in nature have a racist bias or something like that? Or is it really only the legacy of colonialism? I wonder what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I would say, race is a social construct. So if it's a social construct, then it's nurture, basically. And also, that's what I try to show, because that is one of the things people often say, well, it's human nature, to judge, and but it's really not. It's really, of course you can have prejudice, but what I wanted to show was how it was institutionalized, and how, you grow up in a society that wherever you go, that is the message that you get. And even for people of color, we start to believe it also, that we are less. And in that sense, I would say it's nurture, for sure.
So it's erasable.
Sorry?
So it's erasable.
Yes.
To the and a prejudice.
The prejudice.
That's
So
maybe a more difficult thing.
I think prejudice and racism are two different things, because racism is really the idea of superiority, right, and inferiority. So you feel like someone is superhuman and someone is dehumanized. And a prejudice is just, you know, what you take on face value. But a prejudice can easily be erased if you get to know people. And this is also the narrative that a lot of people have in terms of battling racism. Yeah, you just have to get to know people, and then, you know, it's solved. But when your analysis is institutionalized, then you have to dismantle power structures. It's no longer about prejudice, because the prejudice in this, you know, decolonial analysis is the result of institutionalized racism. And you had another question.
The second question was your view on development cooperation, because what we often say is typical colonial model of going to the south and bring ideas or develop a country or help with a school, or which is actually a pretty superior way of thinking.
Yeah.
But what can we do to develop, or even is that in a sense is a wrong meaning? So what should we do with like NGOs in the south now? Should they withdraw, or as a state, what is the involvement of states like in African countries? Should they withdraw, or should they? What is your perspective on how should we deal with that?
Yeah. My initial thought is we don't need to be saved, even though, you know, we recognize that there's a lot of issues, obviously. But I don't believe in the same people who created those issues also solving it, especially if it's not a decolonial approach. Because it's often this white saviorism, you know. So, and I think there are other ways to help communities without it being indeed this idea of, you know, we have the technology or the expertise to help you, because people know, you know, their community. So how could an outsider have that type of expertise? I don't believe in that. I think that if they really want to help, they really have to focus on decolonizing the Western nations, and see, and maybe, no, not maybe, this is definitely reparations, because that is a main issue. You know, if you want to help, reparations, because you stole the resources, you should give back what you stole, and that is a difficult conversation, because then it's no longer about helping people, but about decolonizing, you know, the structures that actually put the people in the position in the first place. So reparations would be my answer to to that type of work. Yeah.
Just in response to the one comment made in the film by the one professor, I think, about how decolonization, or not decolonization, how colonialism is the reason for the breakdown of socio-ecological systems, and that Western or European Enlightenment is the cause for that. So I guess my question is, to what extent do we ascribe the blame to the history and cause of that, and given where, you know, the issues of climate change are now and how we all participate in the system in different ways, you know, to what extent do we allocate responsibility in terms of who must deal with how much sort of damage they've caused, and sort of from the cause root or the process of it. So I don't know if it's clear.
So let me rephrase and tell me if I understand it right. So in terms of the climate change, to what extent do we place blame on colonialism or other factors that have contributed to it, and what does that mean for our strategy today?
I guess, I guess, so, what does it mean, for decolonization, not just from the initial perpetrators, but those that partake in the system?
So how do we all then take part? What is a decolonial approach in this case, and not just for the people, or the factors that were mainly contributors? So we have to deal with it all, you know, today. And you know, I don't think we should have a conversation on blame, because then it becomes kind of like an argument. Who is to blame and who has to solve it? But I do think it's important to talk about responsibility and accountability. And especially because there are a lot of organizations who are not doing the work that needs to be done to prevent or to turn around climate change. And also because a lot of communities are directly suffering. We're only feeling the effects now a little bit. It's okay, the summers are hotter and longer, you know, but we don't deal with the actual devastations that a lot of the global south is dealing with. So I think in that sense we have a collective work to do. So indeed, I wouldn't say, you know, the ones who have done the damage, it's you know, your work, because it affects us all, and I think it's also a statement of solidarity, you know, and do what we can. But we also have to think in terms of power dynamics. Who has the power to actually make the change? And we can demand it, we can, you know, go out on the streets, but who is making the policies? Who is making legislation? Who is, you know, actually, taking the oils from the land and polluting the water? So I think, you know, in that sense, we think about what does it mean for us, and how can we contribute to indeed this decolonization, while keeping in the back of our minds the historical analysis of it. So I look at it in terms of analysis and what does that mean for strategies. But it's important to know, you know, because sometimes people deny the historical legacy, which then makes problematic solutions. So that's why I think the historical analysis is important.
Yeah, just to chime in, maybe just add
Sure.
an idea there as well. I think within the whole climate change debate, that there is like this whole, obviously in the Western world, we're very much individualistic. Everything is so about being, you know, the individual. Hence why we have this whole big focus on, oh, let us ban, you know, plastic straws, for example. That becomes a discussion. That becomes, that's how we're going to solve climate change. Whereas for me, for example, from someone who was born like in Zimbabwe, with the rather collectivistic nature to living, there you understand, you just see that we already, like in other countries, because here in the West we are sort of like struggling in a way of like how we're going to solve climate change, blah, blah, blah. Other indigenous people have been living in harmony with, you know, nature and wildlife. Yeah. And the other part of it as well is that the whole climate change thing as well, we have to understand that everything about colonialism goes hand in hand with capitalism. And which is why, for example, that's when you have this whole capitalist system sort of like making you focus on straws and not making you focus on the fact that, for example, the USA Army is the biggest polluter in the entire planet. It's not making you focus on the multinationals. And it's sort of like also starting to even start to blame indigenous people of like, oh, but they're also eating animals. Why shouldn't they become vegan? When let's be honest, they're not the ones who caused, you know, who caused the planet to go to where it is at this day. So that's when you have to sort of like have to bring that link as well with like colonialism and how it goes hand in hand with capitalism. And sometimes, yes, capitalism does mean there are, for example, black people in the West who want to be very, you know, rich and do enforce that capitalist system. But they are also still enforcing a very colonial system at the end of the day, which has roots within colonialism itself. And that's where it gets messy, because that's when you have people of color also being involved in the whole debate as well. But
yeah, and that's why I really wanted to address, you know, the idea of people of color being also sometimes part of the problem because they reproduce, and white people being able to be decolonial. So that we also learn to look beyond race and color, while acknowledging that, you know, it has this impact. But if we want to move forward, we have to find a new way of looking at race and color. So I think in that sense, yeah, you're absolutely right that, you know, we have to stay critical also in that sense.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for this amazing documentary. It was wonderful, and when I hear about what your aims were for making this film, I think you achieved all of it. Especially to see that it could be shown to like a wide audience. So I have a more practical question: How can we screen this in other classrooms or other spaces, whether private spaces or public spaces?
Yeah. So I have cards with me if you're interested, and we organized this. You just reach out to me, and if you have ideas and specific dates and venues, then we'll make it happen.
Any other questions?
Maybe I want to get in a little bit on the subject, because I'm not really good in English. For me, on first, I got a bit scared because there was a big focus on divided people and minds and worlds. And I think, like you said, it's really important to talk about responsibility and accountability, and about the willingness to get uncomfortable. That's really important. Like, I think we forgot a bit about the history. So I think that's the start when we talk in the West, to remind those people how it went.
Yeah.
Like when I hear things like we don't like ourselves, or that's really a switch we need to turn. So when you want to divide it, you have to be careful, I think, because it's a really strong movie for mobilizing. But like on the rational parts, it's on this balance that can quickly escalate a bit. So it's a sensitive subject.
Yeah.
Like you can't ignore that. But it's really important that there are interactions, and not like a fight against the white people, if I can say that.
But I think, if I can jump in, but I think what's powerful about it is that it's uncomfortable for everyone. Because I think when she says that we don't like ourselves, this is not even something people are willing to say about themselves. Like, if they don't recognize, because the history that you're not taught, other people aren't being taught either. And so there's a global recognition of how history is being told and what's been told, so and I think the point is that these uncomfortable conversations need to get pushed to think more critically about where we are now, because everything's been like sensitively given to us so much.
Yeah.
Because when you get in like the situations where there's a focus on violence, there's gonna be resistance from the white people also.
Yeah.
Because they want that either. There are maybe like kind of people who does, but they are in the
minority.
So there is space for evolution.
Yeah.
I'm positive, but it's the way to choose that's gonna be crucial.
Yeah. Yeah, and I get what you're saying, I want to share two things that kind of respond to that. So one is, like I said, I work in the field of diversity and inclusion, and the approach that you are addressing in terms of, you want to make sure that people who need to hear this are still, with you, because sometimes they can tune out if they feel like, oh, this is too much panic. And that's what I do every day for work. And what I felt was, I want to take you here but we have to start here. And I'm getting tired because I want to tell this story. So this was the story. That's why I said this was the story I had to tell, you know. And this was a story for a specific audience. And actually didn't really realize enough that a lot of people who would feel very uncomfortable would also go and see this. And then we have that conversation, that's fine. But I had a very specific audience in mind, who was also looking for, this narrative, because it's finally saying, you're not crazy. You were right all along. We just didn't have the language and the analysis to talk about it. And two is, this was also a process for me to get to this point to do this, because I've been in music for quite a while, and I always had to balance being political and commercially interesting. If you want to have commercial success as an artist, you can't be too political unless you're white. But as a woman of color, it's really hard. So every time I had to, a very specific example, I had to perform, I had good relations with radio stations, local radio stations, perform there, and I see a picture of them with blackface. And I have to decide, okay, do I then jeopardize my relationship so that I can't perform anymore, or do I stand up for my political beliefs? And I decided to do the latter and, risk not being invited anymore. But because I know them, they accepted it, and I ended up, still going there. But if it was the other option, I would have, accepted that. But it keeps you limited and almost imprisoned, because you can't kind of escape that limitation of not being too much. So there was a turning point where I participated in this musical entrepreneur masterclass, and there was this white A&R manager who, was dealing with all the big names in the music industry in the Netherlands. And I showed him my music, and he said, I think your identity is lacking. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, you should do more with Bollywood. And I was like, oh, scratch the record. Like, what? And at that time, I didn't have the analysis to understand what was going on, so I thought I was crazy. I might be not good enough, etc. And then later on, you kind of reflect and see, wait a minute, this was really, really wrong. And I realized at that moment in time, it's not going to happen for me in terms of commercial success. So I might as well go down fighting. And so I did, and that's why I made this film, because I decided that's okay, and what happens when you use your authentic voice, people respond to that. Because now I go places I didn't even go when I wanted to be mainstream. And mainstream is now seeing me. And now I have to kind of negotiate, because I realize sometimes they can co-opt that, and try to kind of neutralize your voice. So I have to be careful all the time. But I do think it's important to stay in conversation. And when they, act out, then I will address it. But I won't close the door. But I will stay focused on my end game, which is decolonization.
Yeah, I understood when you said you had a really focus, like there is a problem, like there's no discussion.
Yeah.
Then I understand why the perspective of the movie was made. So
yeah.
Like when we talk about Zwarte Piet, it's like a really other story than we are used to, because it's like our childhood. It's like weird to just have white people with just black markets, and not
the roetvegen.
It's so another perspective.
Yeah, and I think,
and I understand the emotional feeling behind it.
And I also understand it. I just think people people say I feel uncomfortable, etc. And on the one hand, I understand it, and on the other hand, I think like we're uncomfortable all our lives. So if this is your first introduction, then you get a sense of what we go through every day. And if you want to connect on a human level, then I think it's also, you know, it's the human thing to do to at least try, you know? And I think that's something that people don't even want to do. They don't want to try. And I hope that, you know, this film at least encourages the people who are trying to do the work to find out what can I do within my context. So this was my way, and I hope that you find ways that works for you, and that might not be so as confronting as this, but hopefully the analysis helps you to have those conversations. That's what I hope.
I'm sure confrontation has to be there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it
Yeah.
won't have impacts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all once again for attending. If you have any questions about Undivided, if you want to know more about Undivided, you can always come and take a flyer here. We'll be organizing more activities. Next week we have the book club. We'll be reading the book Roads Must Fall, a few chapters from there. So if you have time, you can find out all about that on our Facebook page, obviously, and our Instagram and Twitter. That's the next event. And then the week after that, if I'm not mistaken, is the screening of a movie that has to do with LGBTQ+ topics. So a few interesting activities that are coming up. We hope we'll see you there. Otherwise, you can always follow us online, because it's also interesting there. Before I let you go, we had a little surprise for you, obviously. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, and all the best in the struggle.